The Dark Scrolls. In the early years of the 16th century, when the Tudor Rose was still young and Henry VIII had only just begun his reign, a girl was born who would one day stand at the very center of the storms of that dynasty. Catherine Parr entered the world in 1512, the daughter of Sir Thomas Parr of Kendal and his wife Maud Green, a woman who had once served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. The child's birth came at a time of promise for England. The young king was handsome, vigorous, and newly married, and the great dramas that would later shake the kingdom, the break with Rome, the bloodied marriages, the ruthless reshaping of religion, were still far in the future. No one could have foreseen that this infant girl, born into a family of respectable yet not dazzling wealth, would one day become the last wife of that same king, and the only one to survive him. Catherine's early years were shaped by both privilege and fragility. Her father, Sir Thomas, died while she was still very young, leaving her mother to manage the estates and the future of her 3 children. Maud Green Parr was not a woman to surrender easily to hardship. She carried the poise of courtly service, the piety of a devout Catholic upbringing, and the resilience required to oversee property, staff, and alliances in a man's world. Catherine absorbed these qualities like breath itself. She watched her mother govern without a husband, balance debts, oversee tenants, and secure advantageous marriages. The girl learned that survival was not guaranteed, but that it could be achieved through prudence, patience, and intelligence. Such lessons would be etched deep into her soul, preparing her for the treacherous path that lay ahead. Unlike many girls of her generation, Catherine received an unusually rich education. Her mother ensured that she could read and write in English, and soon she mastered Latin and French as well. Later she would add Italian to her repertoire, along with a taste for theology and the humanist writings that was spreading from continental Europe into England. While other young women embroidered linens and rehearsed courtly dances, Catherine found herself drawn to the pages of sacred scripture, to the debates of Erasmus, to the stirring questions of conscience that animated scholars of the Renaissance. Her mind, sharp and curious, thirsted for knowledge. And though she could not know it yet, these studies would become her shield and her solace in the years to come. Her first step into adulthood followed the path expected of a daughter of her station. Around 1529, when she was still in her teens, Catherine married Sir Edward Burgh, grandson of the first Baron Burgh of Gainsborough. Edward was no great catch, but the union was respectable. He was sickly, however, and the marriage was short-lived. Within 4 years, Catherine was a widow, barely 21, childless, and left with little more than the experience of having run a modest household. Yet widowhood for a Tudor woman was not only a condition of loss, but also of freedom. Catherine found herself for the first time mistress of her own choices, and though society would expect her to remarry quickly, she had glimpsed the independence that came from managing her own affairs. Her second marriage, in 1534, would thrust her into a very different world. She became the wife of John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, a man nearly 2 decades older than she, with estates in the north of England, and 2 children from a previous marriage. As Lady Latimer, Catherine resided at Snape Castle in Yorkshire, where the rhythms of rural, aristocratic life seemed steady on the surface, but trembled beneath with political unrest. England was undergoing its great transformation under Henry VIII, who had cast aside Queen Catherine of Aragon, defied the Pope, and seized the wealth of the monasteries. The north of the country, more conservative and more devoutly Catholic than the court in London, erupted into discontent. The Pilgrimage of Grace, A great rebellion against the king's policies swept across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire in 1536, and Lord Latimer was drawn into its orbit. The rebellion brought terror to Snape Castle. Bands of armed men surrounded the household, demanding loyalty, accusing Latimer of betrayal, and threatening Catherine and the children with violence. For weeks she lived under siege, her future balanced on the knife's edge of rebellion and royal reprisal. It was a crucible from which she emerged tempered, not broken. She learned to maintain composure when fear could have paralyzed her, to mediate between hostile forces, and to endure silence when words could condemn her. Though she was only in her mid-20s, she was already learning the arts of survival that would later serve her well as queen consort to one of the most dangerous men in Europe. In the aftermath, Lord Latimer's reputation never fully recovered. The family was drawn into suspicion, their loyalty questioned, their estates shadowed by the memory of rebellion. Yet Catherine remained steadfast. She cared for her stepchildren with a kindness that left a mark on them long after, and she tended to her husband with dutiful loyalty, even as his health declined. Her household was no palace, but it became a school of endurance, of compassion, and of practical governance. She oversaw servants, lands, accounts, and the delicate balance of loyalties in a kingdom where allegiance could change overnight. And all the while, she read. She deepened her study of Scripture, drew closer to the reformist ideas now circulating, and began to shape her own sense of piety that blended humanist inquiry with profound devotion. Within her grew not only the strength of a wife and widow, but also the mind of a thinker. By the early 1540s, Catherine had been twice widowed. In March 1543, Lord Latimer died, leaving her again without a husband, but this time with greater wealth and influence than she had ever possessed. At 31, she was no naive girl, but a mature woman of experience, intelligence, and dignity. Many would have expected her to retreat quietly into the role of dowager, living on her estates, content with piety and modest comfort. But Catherine's life was never to be so still. She had learned the lessons of power, she had tasted independence, and she had begun to sense a calling greater than that of a provincial noblewoman. In the months following Latimer's death, Catherine came to London, where she re-entered the world of the royal court. There she encountered Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third queen, and the mother of the young Prince Edward. Thomas was handsome, ambitious, and charming. Sparks flew between them, and Catherine, for the first time in her life, seemed poised to marry for affection rather than duty. Their relationship was discreet but unmistakable, a tender understanding between two people who had known loss and sought renewal. Catherine may have dreamed, at last, of a life shaped by her own choice, a marriage born of affection, not arrangement, one that would allow her to pursue both companionship and the life of the mind she so cherished. Yet, destiny has a way of silencing such dreams when thrones are involved. For while Catherine's heart inclined toward Thomas Seymour, her future was noticed by a man whose desire was far more powerful. Henry VIII, then in his early 50s, was ailing, corpulent, and plagued by a festering leg wound. He had buried 5 wives, 2 through annulment, 2 through execution, and 1 through childbirth. His temper was infamous, his suspicion boundless, and yet he remained the king, master of England's fate. To his eyes, Catherine Parr appeared as more than a widow of noble standing. She was learned, pious, gracious, and steady, qualities the king lacked in his turbulent household. She seemed the balm for his final years, the queen who could soothe his conscience and bring dignity to his declining reign. For Catherine, the choice was no choice at all. To refuse the king was unthinkable, for it meant ruin, perhaps even death. To accept was to walk into a world of splendor shadowed by danger, a world where queens were crowned, but also destroyed. Yet she had faced rioters at Snape Castle. She had endured widowhood twice, and she had learned that survival required courage. She would marry Henry, and in doing so, she would step onto the stage of history where her name would forever be written. Thus, from the halls of a northern castle to the glittering court of a dying monarch, Catherine's journey carried her inexorably forward. The years of her youth and her first two marriages had prepared her well. They had taught her patience, resilience, learning, and the strength to endure. She had buried 2 husbands, steered through rebellion, and nurtured her own piety in the midst of turmoil. Now she stood at the threshold of the most perilous chapter of her life, soon to become Queen Consort of England, the 6th wife of Henry VIII, and the woman who would one day be remembered as the sole survivor of his tempestuous loves. When Catherine entered the royal court as the new queen consort in July 1543, she stepped into a role laden with peril as much as privilege. The grandeur of Whitehall, the solemn processions at Hampton Court, the glittering pageantry of royal audiences, all of it was intoxicating. But beneath the gilded surface ran currents of suspicion and danger. Henry VIII was no longer the golden prince of Europe, the vigorous athlete who had dazzled foreign courts in his youth. He was heavy with flesh, his once handsome face now swollen with age and pain, his leg ulcerated and foul-smelling. His temper, once boisterous, had curdled into paranoia. To be his wife was not merely to wear jewels and ride in royal carriages. It was to balance on a razor's edge, where a careless word or a hint of disloyalty could lead to disgrace or death. Catherine knew this better than most. She had watched from afar as Anne Boleyn lost her head, and Catherine Howard, still almost a child, was dragged screaming to the scaffold. A fold. She understood that to be queen was to stand in sunlight one day and in shadow the next. Her advantage lay in what she was not. She was not a young temptress like Anne Boleyn, nor a reckless flirt like Catherine Howard. She had no dynastic ambitions that threatened Henry's heirs, no family eager to thrust her forward as a rival power at court. Instead, she came to Henry as a mature woman, modest in demeanor, yet rich in intellect. Someone who could offer him the companionship he craved in his declining years. Where others had vied for his passion, Catherine sought to soothe his soul. She played the role of nurse, confidant, and advisor, all while cloaking herself in humility. In this, she was shrewd. Henry, whose body betrayed him and whose court whispered treason at every turn, found in Catherine a source of calm. She listened to his complaints, encouraged his religious musings, and showed him deference without servility. He trusted her in ways he had trusted few before. Irene's influence soon extended beyond the king's chambers. She became a central figure in the court's religious debates, though always with caution. The 1540s were a dangerous decade for faith in England. Henry had broken from Rome, but refused to embrace the more radical reforms of Luther or Calvin. He positioned himself as head of the Church of England, jealous of his authority in both spiritual and temporal matters. Yet the court seethed with factions. conservatives who longed for the old Catholic rites, and reformists who pushed for a purer Protestant faith. Catherine, educated and devout, leaned toward the reformers. She believed in scripture available in the vernacular, in prayer and meditation accessible to all believers, and in the moral duty of rulers to guide their people toward godliness. These were not trivial opinions. To voice them too boldly was to risk charges of heresy. Yet Catherine, with her measured eloquence, found ways to speak her truth without inflaming the king. Is rough, at least for a time. Her position as queen gave her a platform to publish her own devotional writings, a daring act for any woman, and unprecedented for a queen. In 1545, she brought forth Prayers or Meditations, a collection of spiritual reflections drawn partly from the work of Thomas à Kempis. It became the first book ever published in England under a woman's own name. That alone would have been remarkable, but for Catherine it was more than a personal achievement. It was a statement of faith, a declaration that women could engage in theology, that queens could nurture the souls of their subjects, that a woman's voice could shape the conscience of a kingdom. Henry, proud of his learned wife, approved its publication. To the public, Catherine appeared not as a schemer or a temptress, but as a pious queen, a beacon of virtue beside a weary king. Her most delicate task, however, was not in publishing prayers, but in reconciling the fractured royal family. Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, were the heirs of different mothers, scarred by the rivalries and betrayals of their father's court. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, had endured humiliation when her mother was set aside, and she herself declared illegitimate. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's child, bore the weight of her mother's execution and was regarded with suspicion. Edward, the long-awaited son of Jane Seymour, was the apple of Henry's eye, but he was frail and still a child. Catherine took it upon herself to mend the torn fabric of this family. She treated all three with kindness and respect, offering them maternal affection without favoritism. She encouraged their education, ensured they were present at court, and persuaded Henry to restore both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. By doing so, she not only healed wounds, but secured her place as a queen who brought unity rather than discord. Yet even as she worked to reconcile the king with his children, Catherine's own safety was never assured. The conservative faction at court, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley, eyed her reformist leanings with suspicion. They whispered that she overstepped her bounds, that she presumed to lecture the king on matters of faith. Henry's moods were unpredictable. What he welcomed one day, he condemned the next. Catherine understood that she walked a narrow path. In private, she debated scripture with Henry, challenging him with gentle questions, encouraging him to consider grace and justification by faith. At times he welcomed this as lively discussion. At other times he bristled. It was a dangerous game. For if Henry chose to see her as a heretic, the scaffold would not be far away. In the summer of 1546, that danger nearly became fatal. Gardiner and his allies convinced Henry that Catherine's influence threatened his authority. They prepared an arrest warrant, accusing her of heresy and disloyalty. The Queen's household was thrown into terror. Catherine herself, warned of the plot, acted with extraordinary courage. She went directly to the king, feigned contrition, and told him that she had never presumed to instruct him, but only sought to learn from his wisdom. She said she had spoken of religion only to distract him from his pain and to please him with conversation. Flattered and mollified, Henry reversed his fury. When the guards arrived with the warrant the next day, The king himself rebuked them, sending them away in humiliation. Catherine had come within a breath of ruin, but by wit and humility she had survived. Few queens could have matched such composure under threat of death. Her survival in that moment sealed her reputation as more than a pious wife. She was a woman of extraordinary tact and resilience, one who understood power not as domination, but as the art of navigating storms. For the remainder of Henry's reign, she maintained her influence, nurturing the young Edward, offering companionship to the king, and continuing her quiet promotion of reformist ideas. She even began another work, The Lamentation of a Sinner, which would be published after Henry's death, a more radical text in which she confessed her own unworthiness and emphasized salvation by faith alone. It revealed the depth of her Protestant convictions she had concealed at court for her own safety. Life beside Henry was never serene. His health worsened steadily, his body bloated and crippled by gout, his moods increasingly dark. Yet Catherine bore it with patience. She soothed his anger, tended his wounds, and gave him the sense of dignity he craved in his last years. She was not blind to his faults. No one could be. But she saw in him a man who, despite his cruelty, longed for order and legacy. She gave him both. In her presence he found a measure of peace that had eluded him with his other wives. And in his will, drawn up before his death in January 1547, he acknowledged her with the respect of a true partner, granting her the privileges of a dowager queen and naming her among the executors of his estate. As Henry's life ebbed, Catherine must have felt the weight of history pressing upon her. She had entered his marriage bed knowing the fate of the women who came before. She had faced enemies at court who sought her destruction. She had lived under the constant threat of suspicion from a husband who could send a queen to the block with a single signature. And yet, she endured. She not only endured, but also left her mark. As a writer, as a mediator, as a stepmother who healed the royal family, and as a queen who carried the heavy burden of her husband's last years with grace. When Henry finally died in January 1547, Catherine Parr became the first Queen of England to survive her husband. The bells tolled, the nation mourned, and the great king was lowered into his tomb at Windsor beside Jane Seymour, the mother of his long-desired son. Catherine, still only 35, remained alive, free, or the first time in decades, to shape her own destiny. She had worn the crown, she had walked through fire, and she had emerged intact. In the eyes of the world, she was the survivor, the queen who had outlived Henry VIII. But her story did not end with his death. A new chapter was about to unfold, one in which her heart would guide her choices more than duty, and where love, long deferred, would finally claim her. The death of Henry VIII in January 1547 released Catherine into a world of both freedom and uncertainty. For the first time in nearly 15 years, she was no longer bound by the vows and duties of marriage, no longer tethered to a husband's expectations or a king's volatile temper. She was 35 years old, still in the full bloom of her intellect and dignity. And though she bore the weight of grief, she could not have helped but feel the air of possibility around her. The bells that tolled for Henry's passing also rang for her survival, and in that moment, Catherine Parr became something no queen consort before her had ever been. A widow who had outlived Henry VIII. A dowager Queen of England, with her own household, her own income, and her own future to determine. The court around her was transformed almost overnight. The boy king, Edward VI, not yet 10 years old, was raised to the throne. His uncle, Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset, assumed the role of Lord Protector, governor, governing in the child's name. Power shifted quickly into the hands of men eager to control the new regime, and Catherine watched as the council debated, quarreled, and positioned themselves for dominance. She might have been expected to fade into the background, to play the quiet part of a royal widow devoted only to piety. Yet Catherine was not a woman made for silence. She had already tasted the influence of queenship. She had already written, published, and reconciled heirs. Now, free from Henry's gaze, she began to think again of her own desires. Foremost among those desires was Thomas Seymour. Their affection, born before her marriage to Henry, had never entirely faded. Seymour was everything Henry was not: younger, energetic, ambitious, and skilled in the arts of charm. He had stood by while his elder brother Edward took the reins of government, but Thomas nursed ambitions of his own. In Catherine he saw both a beloved companion and a means of securing greater proximity to the throne. 1. Their reunion was swift, and their courtship barely concealed. Within months of Henry's death, Catherine and Thomas were married in secret, a union that astonished the court when it became known. For many, it seemed indecorous, even scandalous, that the Dowager Queen should remarry so soon. Yet for Catherine, this was at last a marriage of choice, not of duty, and she embraced it with the passion of one who had long been denied her own heart. But love in the Tudor world was never simple. Catherine's new marriage immediately entangled her in the bitter politics of the Protectorate. Thomas Seymour resented his brother's dominance as Lord Protector and sought ways to carve out power for himself. He courted influence with young King Edward, showering him with gifts and attempting to win his trust. He maneuvered with restless energy, seeking an office, a title, anything that might elevate him closer to the throne. Catherine, who had lived through Henry's mercurial reign, recognized this danger in his ambition. She counseled him with the steady wisdom she had gained over years of survival, urging patience, reminding him of the perils of overreach. Yet Thomas was not a man to wait quietly. His hunger for prominence drew suspicion from those around him, and his marriage to Catherine, once revealed, only intensified the scrutiny. For Catherine, the political tension was compounded by a deeply personal responsibility. Into her household came Lady Elizabeth, the teenage daughter of Anne Boleyn. Catherine had long been fond of Elizabeth, admiring her keen mind and ensuring her education was nurtured with tutors of the highest caliber. Alongside Elizabeth came Lady Jane Grey, another brilliant young girl with ties to the crown. In Catherine's care, these girls found both discipline and affection, and for a time, the Dowager Queen's household became a center of learning and refinement. Scholars visited, Latin and Greek were studied, and the seeds of future queenship were sown. Own Elizabeth, in particular, would carry the lessons of those months for the rest of her life, remembering Catherine not only as a stepmother, but as a model of female intellect and dignity. Yet within the walls of that household lay the shadows of scandal. Thomas Seymour, restless and reckless, turned his attention toward the young Elizabeth, in ways that would later taint his memory. Whether from misplaced playfulness or more sinister intent, he engaged with her in a manner that raised eyebrows. He visited her chambers early in the morning, jested with her in ways unbecoming of his station, and provoked whispers that soon reached Catherine herself. For a woman who had endured the fires of suspicion under Henry VIII, such rumors were unbearable. Catherine confronted the situation with sorrow and firmness, sending Elizabeth away from her household to preserve the girl's reputation and to safeguard her own. It was a painful decision, for she cherished Elizabeth, but it was necessary. Even in her pursuit of personal happiness, Catherine could not ignore the dangers that lurked in the games of men. Amid these storms, Catherine experienced a transformation she had long desired but had never thought possible. In the spring of 1548, she discovered she was pregnant. At 36, after 3 marriages without children, she had perhaps begun to believe that motherhood would elude her forever. Now, as she carried life within her, she felt both joy and trepidation. She wrote tenderly of her hopes, her gratitude, her prayers for a safe delivery. To bear a child in her late 30s, after years of widowhood and the strain of queenship, was no small matter. But Catherine embraced the experience with the quiet faith that had sustained her through every trial. She believed this child, born of love rather than politics, would be her greatest gift. Even as she prepared for motherhood, she continued to shape the spiritual life of England. She had already published her prayers, or meditations, during Henry's reign, and now she prepared a more radical work, The Lamentation of a Sinner. In it, she spoke openly of her own unworthiness, of her reliance not on works or ceremonies, but on the mercy of Christ alone. It was a bold statement of Protestant conviction, a departure from the cautious tone she had once adopted to appease Henry. Now, freed from the constraints of his suspicion, she could proclaim her faith with clarity. The book, published shortly before her death, would stand as her spiritual testament, a voice of reform from a queen who had endured the contradictions of her age. But her earthly life was drawing to a close. On August 30th, 1548, at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, Catherine gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour. For a brief moment, joy filled the castle. At last, Catherine was a mother, holding in her arms the child she had longed for through years of duty and restraint. Yet the joy was fleeting. Within days, Catherine was struck by the fever that so often followed childbirth in that age. Her body, weakened by the strain of delivery, could not withstand the infection. The woman who had survived rebellion, intrigue, suspicion, and the tyranny of Henry VIII was undone by the simplest and most relentless of fates, childbed fever. On September 5th, less than a week after her daughter's birth, Catherine Parr died. She was 36 years old. Her last words, recorded by those at her bedside, were prayers of submission to God's will. She spoke of her trust in His mercy, of her readiness to leave the world and commend her soul to Christ. In those moments, she revealed the essence of her life, a woman of faith, intelligence, endurance, and humility. She was buried in the chapel of Sudeley Castle, the only English queen to rest in such a place, her tomb marked not by the grandeur of Westminster, but by the quiet dignity of the countryside. Her infant daughter, Mary Seymour, was left in the care of others, but her fate remains a mystery. She vanished from the records within a few years, believed to have died young, her brief life a poignant echo of her mother's. Thomas Seymour, reckless as ever, would soon be executed for treason, his ambitions finally his undoing. Elizabeth, who had lived under Catherine's roof, would ascend the throne a decade later as Elizabeth I, carrying forward lessons of caution, intellect, and female authority that she had absorbed in those formative years. And Catherine herself, though gone, remained in memory as the woman who had survived Henry VIII and left a legacy of faith and learning that outshone the violence of her age. In her life we see the arc of a woman who moved from the quiet halls of Kendal to the stormy court of a king, who endured widowhood, rebellion, and suspicion, who nurtured children not her own, and who finally, at the end, grasped both love and motherhood, if only for a fleeting moment. She was more than the survivor. She was a writer, a reformer, a stepmother, a queen, and a woman who claimed her own voice in a world that often silenced women. Her story reminds us that survival is not merely the absence of death, but the presence of resilience, intellect, and faith. Catherine Parr's life did not blaze with scandal like Anne Boleyn's, nor shatter with tragedy like Catherine Howard's. Instead, it unfolded with quiet strength, a testament to endurance in the face of peril. She lived long enough to see Henry VIII buried, to see his children restored, to publish her own convictions, and to embrace love on her own terms. Though her final chapter was brief and her child lost to history, Catherine Parr's voice endures. She is remembered not only as the last wife of Henry VIII, but as a woman who, against the odds of her time, made survival into a legacy. After Catherine's death in the late summer of 1548, the household at Sudeley Castle fell into silence, its corridors filled with grief and uncertainty. Her coffin lay beneath the small chapel, the body of a queen, interred not in the grandeur of Westminster, nor in the majesty of St. George's Chapel, but in a quiet resting place in Gloucestershire. Yet even as earth covered her body, her influence lingered. Death did not silence Catherine Parr. In some ways, it gave her life a resonance that would ripple through the decades that followed, shaping the fates of those who had known her and echoing across the unfolding drama of Tudor England. Her infant daughter, Mary Seymour, was the immediate object of sorrow. Born into a storm of politics and grief, the tiny child was a living link to Catherine, her last earthly legacy. Yet Mary's story is shrouded in mystery. She was given into the care of Catherine's close friends and allies, provided for in wills and grants. Yet within a few short years, she disappeared from the records. No marriage contract, no adult estate, no burial register survives to tell her tale. It is as though the child slipped quietly out of the world, a ghost of promise extinguished before it had time to burn. For some, her disappearance symbolized the fragility of women's legacies in that era. How even the daughter of a queen could vanish, forgotten by the chroniclers of kings and battles. But for those who cherished Catherine, the memory of Mary's brief life only deepened the pathos of her story. The survivor of Henry VIII had finally been claimed, not by an executioner's axe or by political intrigue, but by the ancient peril of childbirth, leaving behind a child who could not carry her legacy forward. Yet Catherine's true heirs were not of her blood. They were the young women who had lived under her roof, who had absorbed her lessons, who had watched her balance faith and prudence in a world that devoured the careless. Chief among them was Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who had been sent away from Sudeley in the wake of Thomas Seymour's indiscretions, but who carried with her the indelible mark of Catherine's household. Elizabeth had witnessed how Catherine managed her estates, how she oversaw the education of girls with the same seriousness afforded to boys, how she engaged in theological debate with confidence and grace. From Catherine, Elizabeth learned that women could wield intellect without shame, that piety could be joined to authority, and that survival often depended upon the delicate art of adaptation. In the years to come, as Elizabeth navigated the perils of being a Protestant heir under her Catholic half-sister Mary, and later as she reigned over England herself, she would draw upon those lessons. In the steel of her caution, in the brilliance of her learning, in the endurance that carried her through threats of imprisonment and death, one can glimpse the imprint of Catherine Parr. Lady Jane Grey, too, was shaped by Catherine's influence. The quiet, studious girl who later became the tragic 9 Days Queen had spent formative months in Catherine's care. Catherine had ensured that Jane's education was rigorous, steeped in scripture and humanist thought, cultivating a mind so sharp that scholars marveled at her fluency in languages and theology. Though Jane's destiny would end in the shadow of the executioner's block, her brief reign testified to the intellectual and spiritual legacy Catherine had nurtured. That two of the most remarkable women of Tudor England had been guided by her hand was no coincidence. Catherine had created a model of female authority, grounded not in seduction or scandal, but in learning, devotion, and moral strength. Her writings, too, extended her reach beyond the grave. Prayers, or meditations, published during Henry's lifetime, had already circulated widely among the devout. But it was the lamentation of a sinner, released after her death, that revealed her truest convictions. In its pages she confessed her unworthiness, renounced reliance on ritual, and exalted the grace of Christ as the sole path to salvation. The language was deeply personal, marked by humility, but its theology was unmistakably Protestant. For a Queen of England to leave behind such a testament was extraordinary. Her words provided comfort and inspiration to reformers who sought to push the kingdom further from Rome, and they offered a model of female piety that was both radical and relatable. Even in death, Catherine Parr spoke, her voice joining the chorus of those who would shape the English Reformation. The men who survived her, however, did not all fare so well. Thomas Seymour, her beloved husband of only a brief year, proved unable to temper his ambition. Without Catherine's steady counsel, he pursued reckless schemes, plotting to marry Princess Elizabeth, and even attempting to kidnap the young King Edward VI. His arrogance and folly led him swiftly to the Tower, where in 1549 he was executed for treason. The man who had promised Catherine affection beyond duty, who had finally given her the chance to marry for love, destroyed himself through impatience and vanity. Some mourned him as a victim of his brother's jealousy, others as the architect of his own ruin. For Catherine's memory, his fall was tragic, for it cast a shadow over the love she had chosen with such hope. Yet it also underscored her wisdom, for she had long recognized the dangers in Thomas's character. Without her presence, his fate had been sealed. In the shifting politics of Edward VI's reign, Catherine's absence was deeply felt. She had been a mediator, a steadying hand, someone who could bridge divides without provoking enmity. With her gone, the court became a harsher place. Factions warred more openly, the protectorate fractured, and the boy king was left more vulnerable to the ambitions of men who thought of power before stability. Some contemporaries remarked that had Catherine lived, she might have served as a guardian to Edward, or as a protector to Elizabeth, providing a counterbalance to the turbulence of her age. Such speculation only magnified her reputation, painting her not as a mere survivor, but as a lost hope for stability. Memory of Catherine Parr grew in different ways among those who had known her. To reformers, she was celebrated as a queen who had risked her life for the gospel, a woman whose piety and writings marked her as a forerunner of Protestant England. To her stepchildren, she was remembered with affection, especially by Elizabeth, who spoke of her with gratitude long after she herself became queen. To historians, she became the final figure in the sequence of Henry's wives, the survivor who closed the circle. Yet to those who look closer, she was far more than the last name in a list. She was a woman who had endured the turbulence of her age with grace, who had used her mind and her pen to shape her world, who had offered love whenever she could, and patience where she must. Her tomb at Sudley Castle, though modest, became a place of quiet reverence. Centuries later, when it was rediscovered and restored, visitors marveled at the thought that a Queen of England rested in such a secluded place. The chapel bore witness to the fragility of her life and the endurance of her memory. Unlike Henry, entombed in grandeur beside Jane Seymour, Catherine lay apart, her story less about spectacle and more about resilience. Those who stood before her resting place could reflect on the strange fate that had carried her from Kendal to court, from widowhood to queenship, from survival to motherhood, and finally to death in childbirth. Her journey was emblematic of her age, a time when power was dazzling and deadly, when women were used as pawns yet could, by wit and will, leave their own indelible mark. Even the way she was remembered by the poets and chroniclers of later generations spoke to her uniqueness. She was not sung as a great beauty, nor vilified as a temptress. Instead, she was described as learned, gracious, godly, the very qualities that had preserved her when others fell. In a dynasty defined by bloodshed, she was remembered for her pen rather than her sword, for her prayers rather than her passions. That memory endured, shaping how the world would understand not only her, but the possibilities for women in power. For Elizabeth I, who rose to the throne a decade after Catherine's death, those possibilities became reality. Elizabeth ruled alone, never marrying, guarding her authority with fierce independence. Yet in her early years she had seen Catherine Parr navigate marriage to the most dangerous man in England, survive suspicion, publish her convictions, and educate the heirs of a kingdom. It is not hard to imagine that when Elizabeth sat in council with her bishops, or when she considered the place of women in learning and religion, she recalled the lessons of her stepmother. Catherine's shadow walked beside her, invisible yet profound, shaping the queen who would become Gloriana. In this way, Catherine Parr's influence stretched far beyond her own brief life. She survived Henry VIII, but her survival was not her only achievement. She left behind writings that nurtured the English Reformation. She left behind examples of female intellect and piety that inspired generations. She left behind children, not of her own body, save the short-lived Mary Seymour, but of her heart and her household, who carried her lessons into the highest echelons of power. And she left behind a memory of endurance that stood in contrast to the ruin of so many others. Her story is often summarized with the single word, survivor. Yet, to leave it at that is to miss the depth of her legacy. She was not merely the one who escaped Henry's wrath. She was the one who transformed survival into influence, who turned endurance into testimony, who showed that even in a world that sought to silence women, a queen then could speak, write, and shape the future. Death claimed her at 36, but her voice carried forward, into Elizabeth's reign, into the Reformation, into the memory of England itself. In the silence of Sudley Chapel, where her bones rest, the echo of that voice remains. Catherine Parr, the queen who survived, the queen who wrote, the queen who taught, the queen who endured. Her life ended in the pain of childbirth, but her legacy lives in the history of a dynasty and a nation. Centuries passed, and still the memory of Catherine Parr lingered in the fabric of England's history. While the names of Henry's other wives remained bound to scandal, tragedy, or political consequence, Catherine's story came to stand apart, quieter yet no less significant. She was not remembered for spectacular downfall or dazzling seduction, but for endurance, intellect, and the kind of influence that whispered rather than shouted. Her life, brief yet remarkable, provided a different lens through which to see the Tudor dynasty, not only as a sequence of kings and battles, but as a landscape where a woman could shape thought, reconcile families, and survive the storm of power without losing her voice. In the years immediately after her death, Catherine's writings ensured her presence continued in the realm of English devotion. The Lamentation of a Sinner, circulating widely among reformist circles, found readers among men and women who were themselves negotiating the transition from circa Catholic traditions to Protestant convictions. Her confessional style, full of humility and clarity, struck a chord. Here was not a sermon from a cleric, nor a proclamation from a bishop, but the words of a woman who had walked in the highest chambers of power, and yet confessed herself a sinner, dependent on grace. That voice made the new theology personal, accessible, and deeply human. When later generations spoke of the spread of Protestant ideas under Edward VI and Elizabeth I, Catherine's text was part of the foundation on which they rested. Her book outlived her body, carrying her name into homes and hearts long after her tomb lay quiet. As Elizabeth grew into her destiny, ascending the throne in 1558, Catherine's influence rippled forward. Elizabeth's reign, though shaped by her own formidable will, bore traces of the lessons she had absorbed in Catherine's household. The young princess had seen how a woman could be both learned and devout, how she could engage with theologians, oversee education, and yet remain graceful in the eyes of the world. Elizabeth would later cultivate her own image as a queen of intellect and virtue, one who wrote poetry, engaged with philosophy, and governed with an authority that defied gendered expectation. In the careful balance Elizabeth struck between faith and politics, one can sense echoes of Catherine's own tightrope walk. She had witnessed Catherine survive Henry, not through force but through tact, through the blending of humility and intelligence. Elizabeth, in her own way, perfected that art on the grand stage of European politics. Even Lady Jane Grey, though her life was short and tragic, bore Catherine's imprint. Jane's dazzling command of scripture and languages, her devout Protestant convictions, and her courage in facing death, all reflected the environment Catherine had fostered. When Jane mounted the scaffold in 1554, accused of treason after her brief claim to the throne, she spoke with the calm assurance of one whose faith was deeper than her fear. Catherine had once nurtured that faith, and though the world remembered Jane as the 9 Days Queen, in truth her story was also part of Catherine's legacy, a testament to the power of education and devotion in shaping even the youngest souls. As the Tudor age unfolded, Catherine's name was not always at the forefront. She was overshadowed by the drama of Anne Boleyn's fall, by the tragedy of Catherine Howard, by the towering figure of Elizabeth I. Yet those who studied the past, who traced the currents of influence beneath the waves of politics, recognized her significance. Historians wrote of her as the queen who reconciled Henry with his daughters, who preserved the line of succession that would one day place Elizabeth on the throne. The survival of the dynasty itself owed something to her efforts. Without Catherine's gentle persistence, Mary and Elizabeth might have remained disinherited, their claims lost in the tides of Henry's fury. In restoring them, she helped shape the future of the realm. That act alone was enough to secure her a place in history, yet it was only one strand of her broader legacy. Her story also revealed the shifting possibilities for women in power during the 16th century. Catherine of Aragon had fought for her marriage and her daughter's rights with fierce dignity, Anne Boleyn had reached for influence through passion and intellect. Jane Seymour had secured her place through motherhood. Anne of Cleves had survived through diplomacy. And Catherine Howard had been destroyed by youth and folly. Catherine Parr, by contrast, embodied a different path. She was not defined solely by her relationship to Henry, but by her capacity to endure, to think, to write, and to reconcile. She was not merely the survivor, but the one who demonstrated that survival could itself be a form of influence, that living beyond Henry was not an accident, but a testimony to resilience. In later centuries, as antiquarians uncovered her tomb at Sudeley Castle and restored her memory, visitors reflected on the poignancy of her resting place. Unlike Henry's other queens, she was not interred in the grand mausoleums of kings. Her grave, rediscovered in the 18th century, revealed a body remarkably well preserved, as though time itself had conspired to guard her. The rediscovery sparked renewed interest in her story, reminding the world that a queen had lain forgotten in the quiet countryside. Writers and historians began to reassess her, not only as Henry's final wife, but as a figure of learning and piety in her own right. Sudeley became a place of pilgrimage for those who sought to connect with her memory, to stand in the chapel where she lay, and to reflect on the quiet strength she had embodied. The Romantic era cast her in an even gentler light. Poets and novelists, fascinated by the tragedies of the Tudors, found in Catherine a figure of nobility and grace. Where Anne Boleyn was dramatized as the doomed Enchantress and Catherine Howard as the reckless child, Catherine Parr was depicted as the wise consort, the calm amid the storm. Victorian historians praised her as an early advocate of female education, citing her encouragement of learning among Elizabeth and Jane. Feminist writers in later generations looked to her as an example of a woman who had carved a place for herself in a world designed to silence women, who had written and published despite the strictures of her age. In these retellings, she became more than Henry's last wife. She became a symbol of women's resilience across the centuries. Her life also invites reflection on the strange irony of survival. To survive Henry VIII was to win a rare victory, yet survival alone did not guarantee happiness. Catherine endured him and lived beyond him, but she was claimed by childbirth soon after, her freedom brief and bittersweet. In this, her story mirrors the condition of so many women of her time, who navigated the dangers of politics only to be undone by the dangers of the body. Yet even in this, Catherine left a mark, for her death in childbirth reminded the world that queens were not immune to the risks that claimed countless ordinary women. She stood at the intersection of power and vulnerability, embodying both the heights of influence and the fragility of mortality. When we look back across the sweep of Tudor history, Catherine Parr offers a counterpoint to the drama of her era. She is the queen who published prayers, who reconciled children, who nurtured education, who survived suspicion, and who finally embraced love on her own terms. She is also the queen who died not by axe or annulment, but by the ancient trial of childbirth, whose memory rests not in scandal, but in quiet dignity. Her story complicates the usual narrative of Henry's wives, reminding us that not all were destroyed, that survival itself could be powerful, that influence could be exercised through patience as well as passion. Her legacy can still be felt in the way we understand the Tudor age. Without her, The story of Henry's children would be darker, their succession less certain. Without her, Elizabeth's education might have lacked the maternal guidance that shaped her confidence. Without her, English Protestant devotion might not have received the gentle articulation of the lamentation of a sinner. Without her, the image of a queen as a thinker and writer might have remained unimagined. Catherine Parr filled a role that history often neglects, not the dramatic spark, but the steady flame. Not the shattering tragedy, but the quiet triumph of endurance. As the centuries unfolded, each retelling of Henry's 6 wives seemed to reduce them to a rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. Catherine Parr was the final word in that rhyme, the survivor, the one who endured. Yet her life resists such simplification. She was not simply the queen who lived while others died. She was the woman who gave Henry companionship in his final years, who offered England a model of female learning, who wrote words that resonated with believers, who nurtured the heirs of the kingdom, who carved out a space for herself in a world that left little room for women's voices. Survival was not her only achievement. It was the frame within which her greater contributions could be seen. Today, to stand in the chapel at Sudeley Castle and gaze upon her tomb is to confront the paradox of her story. Here lies a queen of England, buried far from the grandeur of court, her marble effigy serene, her hands folded in prayer. Around her the centuries whisper, and the quiet of the Cotswold Hills presses close. Yet beyond that quiet lies the echo of her life. A girl educated beyond her time, a woman twice widowed before she was 30, a queen who soothed a tyrant, a stepmother who nurtured a future monarch, a writer who confessed her faith, a lover who married for her heart, a mother who died too soon. To tell her story is to weave together strands of survival, faith, intellect, and love, strands that continue to shimmer in the vast tapestry of England's past. Catherine Parr remains, above all, a reminder that history is not only made by the loudest voices or the most violent acts. Sometimes it is shaped by those who endure, who write quietly, who reconcile when others divide, who carry faith through suspicion, who survive long enough to leave behind lessons for the future. She was Henry's last wife, yes, but she was also much more. She was Catherine Parr, queen, writer, reformer, survivor. Her life ended in the stillness of Sudeley, but her story endures, as steadfast as the woman herself. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.